So you're telling me humans actually enjoy being scared? Captain Zakhtharn's four eyes blinked in rapid succession, the tough hide around his mandibles crinkling in what his human companion had learned to recognize as confusion. Hell yeah, we do. Lieutenant James Miller leaned back in his chair, boots propped up on the table in the starship's mess hall. Ever heard of horror movies? Haunted houses? Ghost stories around a campfire? That's prime entertainment where I come from. The massive Vkr'lak warrior chittered softly, a sound the ship's translator couldn't quite parse, but Miller had come to understand as skepticism. Standing nearly 8 feet tall with an exoskeleton that could deflect small arms fire, Zakhtharn was considered one of the most fearsome soldiers in the Galactic Confederation. The fact that something as simple as human recreational activities could baffle him never ceased to amuse Miller. Fascinating, the alien captain said finally. In my species, fear is considered a weakness to be purged through rigorous mental conditioning. The idea of deliberately inducing it for pleasure. He practically spat the word. It's difficult to comprehend. The mess hall was quiet at this late hour. The skeleton crew of the diplomatic vessel, harmonious exchange, either sleeping or manning essential stations. The unlikely friendship between the human diplomatic security attaché and the Vkr'lak captain had blossomed during these late-night conversations, where cultural exchanges flowed as freely as the synthesized alcohol substitutes they both pretended were satisfactory. That's because you don't understand the context, Miller said, taking a swig from his glass of something that claimed to taste like whiskey, but reminded him more of cough syrup with delusions of grandeur. Fear in a controlled environment is different. It's like exercise for your emotions. You get the adrenaline rush without actually being in danger. Humans deliberately trigger their fight or flight response for entertainment. Zakhtharn wasn't asking a question, merely stating this bizarre fact aloud as if trying to make it make sense. The same biological reaction that evolved to keep you alive in dangerous situations. Pretty much, yeah. And this doesn't seem counterproductive to your species? Miller shrugged. Look who's talking. Your people literally stab each other with ceremonial daggers as a greeting. That's different, Zakhtharn said defensively, his secondary arms crossing over his chest while his primary ones remained on the table. The blood greeting is a sacred tradition that establishes mutual respect through shared pain. It serves a purpose. So does scaring ourselves shitless every now and then. Miller grinned. Keeps us humble. The Vkr'lak's antennae twitched forward in interest. In what way? Miller contemplated his answer, swirling the amber-colored liquid in his glass. I guess it reminds us of our limitations. That for all our technology and progress, we're still animals with instincts and weaknesses. He paused. Plus, it's just fun as hell. You humans continue to perplex me, Zakhtharn admitted. Your species is simultaneously one of the most aggressive and most empathetic in the Confederation. You create art dedicated to frightening yourselves, yet you also produce music that moves even the most stoic Alarian to tears. We contain multitudes, Miller quipped. Speaking of which, have I ever told you about the time my unit got stranded in the Siberian wilderness during a training exercise gone wrong? Zakhtharn leaned forward, his interest obviously piqued despite himself. You have not. Miller's eyes gleamed with mischief. Well, buckle up, Captain. This is what we humans call a war story, and I promise it'll give even a battle-hardened Vkr'lak like yourself something to think about. So there we were, Miller began, settling into storyteller mode. 8 of us. Middle of Russian winter, temperatures hitting -40 Celsius, which is coincidentally also -40 Fahrenheit because that's the weird point where the scales meet. I am familiar with human temperature measurements, Zakhtharn said dryly. Please continue. Right, sorry, military habit. Assume everyone needs everything explained in excruciating detail. Miller grinned. Anyway, our dropship had mechanical issues. Later we found out it was sabotage, but that's a different story altogether. We crash-landed about 80 kilometers from our designated extraction point, with minimal supplies and comms knocked out by the electromagnetic storms that plagued the region. Zakhtharn nodded. A challenging situation, but surely not unprecedented for trained soldiers. Under normal circumstances, sure. But these weren't normal circumstances. Miller leaned forward, lowering his voice. See, the region we were in. There had been reports from local villagers about things in the woods. Things that hunted at night. The Vkr'lak's mandibles clicked together dismissively. Superstition. All primitive cultures develop myths about predators to warn their young. That's what we thought too, Miller said with a knowing smile. Protocol dictated we establish a defensive position and wait for rescue, but with the comms down and the weather worsening, our CO, Lieutenant Colonel Harker, made the call to move toward extraction. Better to die trying than freeze waiting for help that might never come. A sound tactical decision, Zakthorn approved. First night was uneventful. We set up a perimeter, took watches in pairs, standard stuff. Miller took another sip of his drink. Second night is when things got weird. Martinez and Cooper were on watch when they reported movement in the tree line. By the time we got our night vision gear activated, whatever it was had disappeared. Wildlife, presumably. That's what we told ourselves. But the weird part was the tracks we found in the morning. They looked almost human, but wrong. Too long. Toes splayed out at unnatural angles. And they came right up to our perimeter before circling the entire camp and disappearing back into the forest. Zakthorn's skepticism was evident, but Miller could see the Vkr'lak was engaged in the story. Miller continued, his voice dropping even lower. Third night, we doubled the watch. 4 of us awake at all times, full perimeter coverage. Around 0200 hours, the temperature suddenly dropped even further. I mean dramatically, like 15 degrees in minutes. Our breath was freezing in front of our faces. A weather phenomenon, Zakthorn offered. That's what Williams said too, right before he started screaming. Miller paused for effect. We found him staring into the darkness, his rifle on the ground, just screaming. Not in pain, not in fear. Just screaming like he was trying to match something he was hearing. The mess hall lights seemed to dim slightly, though Miller knew it was just the ship's night cycle adjusting the illumination. The effect was perfectly timed. By the time we got Williams calmed down, he couldn't remember what had happened. But Harker was spooked enough to order us to break camp immediately. We marched through the night, which is about the stupidest thing you can do in those conditions, unless you're more afraid of staying put. Zakthorn's antennae were now fully extended, a sign of alertness that the Vkr'lak probably wasn't even aware of. Miller suppressed a smile and pressed on. The 4th day we lost Jackson. 1 minute he was bringing up the rear of our formation, the next he was gone. No sound, no struggle. Just gone. We backtracked for hours, but found nothing except a single boot, perfectly placed in the middle of our trail as if it had been left there deliberately. Your soldier deserted, Zakthorn suggested, but his tone lacked conviction. In the middle of nowhere? In lethal cold? With no supplies? Miller shook his head. No way, something took him, and whatever it was playing with us. The Vkr'lak shifted uncomfortably. Continue. That night, we didn't even pretend we were going to sleep. We formed a circle, backs to each other, facing outward. Every noise, every shadow had us jumping. And there were a lot of noises. Miller's eyes seemed to look through Zakthorn, as if gazing into the past. Whispers just at the edge of hearing. Sounds like laughter, but distorted. And every so often we'd hear Jackson's voice calling for help from different directions. A psychological warfare tactic, Zakthorn said, his voice slightly strained. Using recorded sounds to disorient enemies. Several species employ similar methods. That's what we told ourselves. Had to stay rational, right? Miller nodded. But then Williams started answering the voices, having conversations with them that we couldn't hear the other side of. When Harker ordered him to stop, he looked confused, said he was just answering the radio. But his comm unit was dead like all of ours. Zakthorn was fully invested now, his earlier skepticism giving way to genuine interest. What happened next? Day 5, we finally got a break. The storms cleared enough that our emergency beacon started working. Extraction was on the way, but we still had to reach the rendezvous point by nightfall. We pushed hard, everyone on edge. Williams kept falling behind, talking to himself. Cooper was developing frostbite but refused to acknowledge it. And I started seeing things at the corners of my vision. Tall, thin shapes moving between the trees, always just out of focus. Miller paused to take another drink, letting the silence stretch. When he spoke again, his voice was hushed. About 2 clicks from the extraction point, we found a cave. Natural formation, but there was evidence someone, or something, had been using it. Old fire pit, strange markings on the walls. And bones. Lots of bones, most of them animal, but some looked human. Zakthorn's mandibles tightened against his face, a Vkr'lak expression of tension. Harker wanted to press on, but a blizzard hit us out of nowhere. Visibility dropped to 0. We had no choice but to take shelter in the cave. Miller's eyes were distant now, lost in the memory. We set up a defensible position near the entrance, but the cave went deep, way deeper than we could see with our lights, and there were sounds coming from the darkness. Scraping. Clicking. Something moving. Zekthorn was completely still now, a predator's instinctive response to potential threat. Williams volunteered to investigate. Harker ordered him not to, but he wasn't right anymore. Kept saying, "They're calling me." Before anyone could stop him, he disappeared into the darkness. We heard him walking away, his footsteps echoing, then other footsteps joining his, many of them, with an odd rhythm, like whatever was making them had too many legs, or legs that bent in the wrong places. Miller leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Then the screaming started. Zakthorn's 4 eyes were wide open, unblinking, the Vkr'lak equivalent of being on high alert. Your comrade encountered hostile entities? That's how it sounded. Miller nodded gravely. But here's where it gets really strange. The screaming changed. Started as pain, fear, then became something else. Almost like ecstasy, rapture, and then voices. Dozens of them, all talking at once. Some in languages I didn't recognize. And one of them was definitely Williams. But he wasn't calling for help anymore. He was inviting us to join him. The Vkr'lak captain shifted in his seat, his exoskeleton making a soft scraping sound against the metal chair. What did your commanding officer do? Harker made the call to seal off the tunnel. We used explosives to collapse the entrance to the deeper cave system, trapping whatever was down there, including Williams. You abandoned your comrade? Zekthorn sounded genuinely shocked. Miller's face hardened. We abandoned whatever Williams had become, because by then we were all pretty damn sure it wasn't Williams anymore. Not completely. Zekthorn's antennae quivered slightly. I understand. Continue. We maintained our position near the cave entrance through the night. The blizzard outside was nothing compared to what we heard from behind that rock wall we'd created. Scratching, digging, and voices. So many voices, some whispering, some screaming, all speaking in unison. Words I couldn't understand but somehow knew were wrong. Fundamentally wrong. Like they were damaging reality just by being spoken. Miller took a long drink, emptying his glass. By morning, the sounds had stopped, the blizzard cleared. We made contact with our extraction team and got the hell out of there. Officially, Williams was reported as missing in action, presumed dead. The rest of us were debriefed separately and told never to discuss what happened. 2 weeks later, Cooper walked into the ocean during shore leave and didn't come back. Martinez requested immediate transfer to a desk job. Harker. Well, last I heard, Harker was in a military psychiatric facility, under constant supervision after attempting to dig through his apartment floor with his bare hands, claiming he could hear them calling from below. Zekthorn was silent for a long moment. And you seem functional. Miller smiled thinly. I developed a theory. Whatever was in that cave, whatever took Williams and broke the others, it feeds on fear. The more afraid you are, the more control it has over you. So I decided not to be afraid. Simply decided? Zekthorn sounded skeptical again. Not exactly. I researched similar incidents throughout history. There are records, if you know where to look, of encounters with entities that match what we experienced. Some cultures called them Wendigo, others skinwalkers, others had no name for them at all. But there was a pattern. Those who survived did so by confronting their fear, acknowledging it, then setting it aside. Miller leaned back in his chair. So that's what I did. I accepted that there are things in the universe beyond human understanding, things that can reach into your mind and twist it. And once I accepted that, they lost their power over me. The Vkr'lak captain was studying Miller with a new intensity. This is why humans deliberately frighten themselves for entertainment. It is training. Miller grinned. Give the alien a prize. Every horror movie, every ghost story around the campfire. It's practice for facing the real horrors. The universe is vast and ancient, Captain. Humans are young and small by comparison. We know there are monsters out there. We just want to be ready when we meet them. Zekthorn was quiet for a long moment. I have fought in 17 major conflicts across 12 star systems. I have faced enemies that would liquefy most beings with terror, but I have never considered fear itself as something to be cultivated and directed. He sounded almost impressed. Humans are more complex than I had realized. We're full of surprises, Miller agreed. Now, want to hear about the time my squad encountered something even worse in the ruins of old Jakarta? The Vrekian's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation. Perhaps another time, Lieutenant. He rose from his seat, massive frame casting a shadow across the table. I must check on bridge operations. As Zektharn departed with unusual haste, Miller allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Score 1 for humanity. He'd managed to unnerve one of the galaxy's most notorious warriors with nothing but words and imagination. 3 days later, Miller found himself summoned to the ship's training deck. When he arrived, he was surprised to find it darkened, the environmental controls set to create a misty, cool atmosphere. The lighting was minimal, casting long shadows across the usually bright, sterile space. "Captain!" Miller called out, his hand instinctively moving to the sidearm he wasn't currently carrying in the diplomatic vessel. "Enter, Lieutenant." Zektharn's voice echoed from somewhere in the darkness. "And close the door behind you." Curiosity overcoming caution, Miller stepped fully into the training deck, letting the door slide shut. Immediately, sounds began to emerge from hidden speakers. Rustling movements, distant howls, the creak of something heavy shifting in darkness. "Okay, what the hell is this?" Miller asked, turning slowly as he tried to pinpoint the Vrekian captain's location. Zektharn emerged from the shadows, his exoskeleton gleaming dully in the low light. "I have been contemplating our conversation about fear as training. It is not without merit." The alien's 4 eyes fixed on Miller. "I have created what I believe would be called a haunted house in human culture, based on the ship's database of Earth horror concepts." Miller blinked in surprise. What now?" "I wish to understand this human practice." Zektharn's mandibles clicked in what Miller had come to recognize as determination. "You will experience this simulation and explain your physiological and psychological responses." Before Miller could reply, a holographic projection activated near them. A surprisingly accurate recreation of a human corpse, partially decomposed, that rose from the floor and turned empty eye sockets toward them. "Jesus!" Miller jumped to spite himself, then laughed. "Okay, that's actually pretty good." "You are experiencing fear?" Zektharn asked, pulling out a small device that Miller recognized as a biological scanner. "More like startlement, but yeah, close enough." Miller grinned. "This is unexpectedly thoughtful of you, Captain. Weird as hell, but thoughtful." "It is research," the Vrekian corrected stiffly. "The Confederation faces unknown threats from uncharted regions. If humans have developed psychological techniques to resist fear-based attacks, such knowledge could be valuable." "Right. Pure research. Got it." Miller's tone made it clear he didn't believe that for a second. "Lead on then. Show me what you've got." For the next hour, Miller found himself guided through what had to be the most bizarre cultural exchange in diplomatic history. Zektharn had clearly studied Earth's horror traditions with surprising thoroughness, incorporating elements from various human cultures. Japanese yurei with their long black hair, Eastern European vampiric traditions, and even some rather impressive recreations of scenes from classic horror films. What made it particularly interesting was watching the Vrekians' reactions. Though ostensibly observing Miller, Zektharn himself flinched at sudden movements, chittered nervously at prolonged suspense, and once actually emitted a high-pitched trill when a holographic creature lunged unexpectedly from darkness, a sound Miller suspected was the Vrekian equivalent of a scream. After a particularly effective simulation of being stalked through fog by unseen predators, they paused in what the ship's systems had configured as a small rest area, complete with synthesized beverages. "So," Miller said, accepting a cup of something warm that claimed to be cocoa but tasted more like malty dirt. "Learning anything useful?" Zektharn consulted his scanner. "Your physiological responses are fascinating. Heart rate elevated but within controlled parameters. Adrenal output increased but not to combat levels. Cognitive function remains sharp." The alien's head tilted. "You are afraid, yet enjoying it?" "That's the whole point," Miller confirmed. "The rush without the actual danger." "I am beginning to understand," Zektharn admitted. "There is a certain satisfaction in confronting simulated threats and emerging unharmed." Miller studied the massive alien warrior. "You got scared a few times yourself. Don't think I didn't notice." Zektharn's secondary arms crossed defensively. "I was merely sympathetically mirroring your responses to better understand the experience." "Uh-huh." Miller didn't bother hiding his skepticism. "That high-pitched whistle when the ghost girl came out of the ceiling was totally scientific, I'm sure." The Vkr'lak's mandibles clicked rapidly in embarrassment. It was unexpected. That's what makes it fun, Miller said, finishing his pseudo-cocoa. Now, what else have you got planned? Because I've got to say, this is way more entertaining than that diplomatic reception scheduled for tomorrow. There is one final scenario, Vkr'lak said, his tone turning serious. Based on your Siberian story. Miller's smile faded. My what now? The cave. The entities that took your comrade. Vkr'lak's eyes fixed on Miller. I wish to understand what truly frightens humans. Not the superficial startles, but the deep fear. The existential terror. A chill that had nothing to do with the environment controls ran down Miller's spine. That's not a great idea, Captain. The simulation is already programmed. Vkr'lak gestured toward a darkened section of the training deck. I utilized your description and historical references to recreate the experience as accurately as possible. Miller felt a knot forming in his stomach. Look, there's a line between fun scary and actually messing with your head scary. I think we should call it a day. Are you afraid, Lieutenant? There was a challenge in the Vkr'lak's voice, but also genuine curiosity. Not of your holographic light show, Miller said carefully. But some things, some concepts, are better left alone, even in simulation. Vkr'lak studied him for a long moment. Now I am truly intrigued. Was your story real, Miller? Did these events actually occur? Miller hesitated. Parts of it, he admitted finally. The crash landing, the wilderness survival, that all happened. The other elements. Let's just say I embellished for dramatic effect. Yet you are reluctant to face even a simulation based on your own fabrication. Vkr'lak's antennae twitched forward. Fascinating, Miller sighed. The best scary stories contain kernels of truth, Captain. That's what gives them power. Then help me understand this power. Vkr'lak gestured again toward the darkened area. One final scenario, and I will consider this research complete. Against his better judgment, Miller found himself nodding. Fine, but remember, you asked for this. The simulation began subtly. The training deck transformed into a snow-covered forest, wind howling between holographic trees that looked disturbingly real. The temperature dropped noticeably, not to dangerous levels, but enough to make Miller's breath visible. Your environmental controls are impressive, he admitted, zipping up his uniform jacket. The ship was designed for diplomatic functions, Vkr'lak explained, walking beside him through the simulated snow. Accurate recreation of various planetary conditions facilitates negotiations. They walked in silence for a few minutes, the crunch of snow beneath their feet, the only sound besides the moaning wind. Gradually, Miller became aware of a subtle wrongness to the scenario. The trees were slightly too tall, their branches reaching like grasping hands. The shadows between them seemed deeper than they should be, moving in ways that didn't match the wind's patterns. Nice touch with the visual distortions, Miller commented, trying to maintain his composure. Very psychological. Vkr'lak didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was oddly subdued. I but did not program such effects. Miller glanced sharply at the Vkr'lak. Very funny. I assure you I am not attempting humor. Vkr'lak's 4 eyes were scanning the tree line. The simulation parameters were basic. Environment, temperature, lighting. These anomalies are not part of my design. Before Miller could respond, a sound cut through the wind. A long, low howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a wolf or any animal Miller recognized. It was almost vocal, almost words. Okay, that's enough. Miller turned to the ceiling. Computer end simulation. Nothing happened. The forest remained, and the howl came again, closer this time. Computer, authorization Vkr'lak, Captain, override protocol Gamma 6. End simulation. The Vkr'lak's voice was tense. The forest flickered once, but remained. And now there were shapes moving between the trees. Tall, thin silhouettes that seemed wrong in proportions that Miller's brain couldn't quite process. Something's malfunctioning, Miller said, forcing calm into his voice. Let's head back to the entrance. They turned, only to find the path behind them different. Narrower, the trees closer together, the darkness between them deeper. And there, in the distance, a faint light that hadn't been there before. This is impossible, Vkr'lak hissed, his mandibles clicking rapidly in agitation. The training deck is 40 meters by 30 meters. We cannot have walked far enough to lose sight of the entrance. Miller's hand went instinctively to where his sidearm would be, finding nothing. It's just a glitch in the holographic system. The walls are still there, even if we can't see them. To prove his point, he stepped off the path, moving toward where he thought the actual wall of the training deck should be. After 10 steps, he should have reached it, but the forest continued, growing darker and more dense. "Lieutenant," Zekthorn called, an unfamiliar note in his multi-toned voice. "Look!" Miller turned. In the snow behind them, clearly visible, were tracks, but not their own. These were elongated, with too many toe impressions, splayed at unnatural angles, exactly as he had described in his story. "That's not funny, Captain." Miller's voice had an edge now. "I did not program this," Zekthorn insisted, his secondary arms drawing closer to his body in what Miller recognized as a defensive posture. "The simulation was basic environmental effects only. No entities, no tracks." The howl came again, much closer, and this time Miller could almost make out words within it. Almost his name. "Fuck this," he muttered, picking up a heavy branch from the ground. "Computer, emergency shutdown. Security override Miller 47 Alpha Tango." The forest flickered more violently this time, the trees briefly replaced by the grid pattern of the training deck's holographic projectors, but then snapped back into place, more solid than before. And now the light in the distance was clearly visible. The mouth of a cave, illuminated by a faint, pulsing glow from within. "This is not possible," Zekthorn whispered, his usual confidence completely evaporated. Miller gripped the branch tighter, though he knew it was just a holographic projection and would offer no real protection. "We need to get to the door. It has to be." He turned in a circle, trying to get his bearings. "That way, I think." A sound from behind them, branches breaking under heavy weight. They turned to see a figure at the edge of visibility, too tall, too thin, its proportions subtly wrong in ways that made Miller's eyes hurt to look at it. "Run," he said simply, and they did. They crashed through the simulated forest, snow crunching beneath their feet, branches whipping at their faces. Miller knew they must have crossed the physical boundaries of the training deck several times over, yet the forest continued endlessly. The laws of physics as he understood them were being casually violated, and that thought terrified him more than any holographic monster could. "There!" Zekthorn pointed ahead with one of his primary arms. A clearing had appeared, and in its center, incongruously, stood the standard-issue door to the training deck, looking entirely out of place amid the wilderness. They sprinted for it, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind them. As they reached the clearing, Miller risked a glance back and immediately wished he hadn't. Multiple figures were emerging from the tree line, humanoid but wrong, their limbs too long, joints bending in impossible directions, their faces. Miller wrenched his gaze away before he could fully process what he'd seen where faces should be. "Door! Now!" They reached it together, Zekthorn slapping the control panel while Miller turned to face whatever was pursuing them, branch held before him like a weapon. The door slid open, revealing the brightly lit corridor of the harmonious exchange. "Go!" Miller shoved the Vkr'lak through the doorway, following immediately after. As the door slid closed behind them, he caught one last glimpse of the forest, and of something reaching for the closing gap with limbs that seemed to elongate impossibly as they stretched toward the doorway. Then the door sealed shut with a reassuring hiss of pressurization, and they were standing in the normal, mundane corridor of the diplomatic vessel, breathing hard, surrounded by the curious stares of passing crew members. "What the hell was that?" Miller demanded once they had sequestered themselves in Zekthorn's private quarters. "And don't tell me it was part of your simulation because I saw your face. You were as freaked out as I was." The Vkr'lak captain was pacing, all four of his arms moving in agitated patterns. It should not have been possible. The holographic systems have safety limiters, physical boundaries. They cannot create environments that extend beyond the training deck's actual dimensions. Well, something overrode those limiters, Miller said grimly. "Either that or..." "Or?" Zekthorn prompted when Miller didn't continue. Miller shook his head. "Nothing, just a crazy thought." "Speak it," the Vkr'lak insisted. "After what we just experienced, I think we are beyond dismissing ideas as crazy." Miller sank into a chair designed for human physiology, a diplomatic courtesy in the captain's quarters. "The simulation. It was too accurate to what I described in my story. Not just the basic elements, but details I only mentioned once. The tracks in the snow, the cave with the light, the way those things moved. I programmed the basic scenario based on your description," Zekthorn said. "But as I told you, I included no entities or anomalies." "Then where did they come from?" Miller asked quietly. The Vkr'lak's four eyes focused on him intently. "You believe... what exactly?" Miller leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What if it wasn't a malfunction? What if somehow the simulation tapped into something real? Something I accidentally described accurately enough that when you recreated it in the holographic system, it noticed? That is not scientifically plausible, Zik'Tharn said, but his tone lacked conviction. 2 hours ago I would have agreed with you, Miller replied. But we both experienced something that violated the physical constraints of the training deck. Unless you have a better explanation, I'm open to considering some pretty wild alternatives. The Vkr'lak captain was silent for a long moment. There are legends among my people, he said finally. Ancient stories of entities that exist between spaces, in the folds of reality. Beings that can be summoned through certain patterns of thought or word. His mandibles clicked rapidly. They are considered superstition, remnants of pre-scientific thinking. Every human culture has similar legends, Miller said. We call them by different names, but the concept is universal. Things that live just outside our reality, looking in. Things that can be accidentally invited in through the right combination of words or actions. If such entities existed, Zik'Tharn said carefully, and if they could be summoned through accurate description, why would they respond to a holographic recreation? It was not real. Miller smiled grimly. Maybe reality is more flexible than we think, or maybe... He hesitated. Maybe they were already here, watching, waiting for someone to open a door. Even a simulated one. The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Finally, Zik'Tharn broke the silence. This vessel will arrive at Diplomatic Station Epsilon 7 in 14 hours. I suggest we agree to never speak of this incident again. Miller nodded slowly. Probably wise. But Captain, what if we brought something back with us? What if that door closing wasn't quite fast enough? The Vkr'lak's exoskeleton seemed to tighten around him. Then we have potentially introduced an unknown extra-dimensional entity to a diplomatic vessel carrying representatives from 17 species, bound for a station housing thousands of beings from across the Confederation. Yeah, Miller sighed. That's what I was afraid you'd say. The remaining hours aboard the Harmonious Exchange passed in a state of heightened tension, at least for Miller and Zik'Tharn. They had agreed not to spread alarm by sharing their experience, but both found themselves jumping at shadows, startling at unexpected sounds, and generally behaving in ways that drew curious looks from the ship's crew. They ordered a full diagnostic of the training deck's holographic systems, which revealed nothing unusual. The computer logs showed the simulation had never exceeded its programmed parameters, a simple snow-covered forest with basic environmental effects. There was no record of the cave, the tracks, or the entities they had both clearly seen. By the time they docked at Epsilon 7, Miller had almost convinced himself it had been some sort of shared hallucination, perhaps triggered by a gas leak or power surge that the diagnostics had failed to detect. Almost, but not quite. As they prepared to disembark, Zik'Tharn approached him in the shuttle bay. "Lieutenant Miller." The Vkr'lak captain's formal tone was back in place, though Miller noticed his secondary arms were held closer to his body than usual. "It has been educational serving with you." "Likewise, Captain." Miller extended his hand in the human gesture of farewell, which Zik'Tharn had learned to reciprocate during their time together. "Before you go," the Vkr'lak said, his voice lowered despite the relative privacy of their position, "I must ask one final question." Miller raised an eyebrow. "Shoot." "Your story, the one about the Siberian incident. You admitted you embellished it for effect." Zik'Tharn's 4 eyes focused intently on Miller's face. "How much of it was true?" Miller hesitated, then glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "The crash landing happened. The weather was bad. We lost a man, Jackson, but it was to exposure, not anything else." He paused. "The rest was just a ghost story. Horror fiction." "I see." The Vkr'lak's mandibles relaxed slightly. "So there was no cave? No entities?" "No cave," Miller confirmed. "I mean, there are caves in Siberia, but we never encountered one. That was pure imagination." "That is somewhat reassuring." Zik'Tharn released Miller's hand, "though it does not explain what occurred in the training deck." Miller shrugged. "Technology glitches, shared suggestion, maybe something in the ship's atmosphere affecting our perceptions. I'm sure there's a rational explanation." "Of course," the Vkr'lak agreed, a bit too quickly. "Rational explanations exist for all phenomena, once properly investigated." The station's arrival announcements began blaring through the shuttle bay, and Miller hefted his duffel bag. "Well, Captain, it's been interesting. If you're ever in Earth's sector, look me up. I've got plenty more stories to tell." "I shall consider it," Zik'Tharn said, with what Miller recognized as diplomatic evasiveness. With a final nod, Miller turned and joined the line of personnel disembarking from the Harmonious Exchange. As he waited for his turn to board the station shuttle, he couldn't resist one last glance back at the Vkr'lakian captain. Zekatharn stood rigidly at attention as military protocol dictated during disembarkation. But Miller noticed something odd. The captain's 4 eyes weren't focused on the departing crew. Instead, he was staring intently at the shadows in the corner of the shuttle bay, his posture suggesting not military discipline, but a predator's alertness to potential threat. Miller followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual in the shadowed alcove. Just darkness. Ordinary darkness. Probably. 6 months later, Lieutenant James Miller found himself assigned to Earth's Diplomatic Reception Center in Geneva, a comfortable posting that many considered a reward for his successful tour on the Harmonious Exchange. The work was routine, greeting alien dignitaries, coordinating security for diplomatic functions, occasionally giving guided tours of Earth's historical sites to particularly important visitors. It was, in short, boring as hell. He was slouched at his desk, half-heartedly reviewing security protocols for an upcoming Brachian trade delegation, when his comm unit chimed with an incoming priority message. The sender code made him sit up straight. Galactic Confederation High Command, diplomatic channel, encrypted. Miller activated his secure terminal and accepted the transmission. To his surprise, the face that appeared on the screen belonged to Captain Zekatharn. "Captain," Miller greeted him, unable to hide his surprise. "This is unexpected." "Lieutenant Miller." The Vkr'lakian looked exactly as Miller remembered, though perhaps the exoskeleton around his mandibles had darkened slightly, a sign of aging in his species. "I trust you are well." "Can't complain. Geneva's a nice posting." Miller studied the alien's face on the screen. "You didn't call to check on my career satisfaction, though. What's up?" Zekatharn's mandibles clicked together once, a gesture of acknowledgement. "Direct as always." "Very well. I am currently commanding the defensive escort for a Confederation archaeological survey vessel, the Empirical Truth. We are investigating ancient ruins discovered on a previously uncharted world in what your people call the Canes Venatici II stellar group." "Sounds more interesting than checking dignitaries for weapons," Miller admitted. "But I'm still not seeing why that warrants a priority call to Earth." "The ruins," Zekatharn said, his voice dropping slightly, "appear to predate all known Confederation civilizations. Preliminary estimates suggest they are at minimum 500,000 standard years old." Miller whistled. "That's old, even on a galactic scale. But again, fascinating as this is, I'm wondering why—" "Among the artifacts recovered," Zekatharn interrupted, something he rarely did, "were records, images, writing in no known language." The Vkr'lakian paused, all 4 of his eyes blinking in sequence, a sign of significant stress. "Lieutenant Miller, these records contain depictions of entities that match, with disturbing precision, what we encountered in the training deck simulation." Miller felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "That's not possible." "I am forwarding securely encoded images to your terminal now." Zekatharn's secondary arms moved in agitated patterns just visible at the edges of the screen. "I require your assessment." Miller's terminal chimed as the files arrived. With a growing sense of unease, he opened them. The first was a 3-dimensional scan of what appeared to be a stone relief carving, worn by time but still clearly visible. It showed elongated, multi-limbed figures surrounding shorter, more conventional bipedal forms. The proportions of the taller figures were wrong, familiar in their wrongness. "Shit," Miller muttered. "There are 17 more such depictions among the ruins," Zekatharn said, "all showing similar entities. The archaeological team believes they represent deities or mythological beings from the extinct civilization that created these structures." Miller scrolled to the next image. A close-up of writing etched into stone, strange angular symbols that seemed to shift slightly as he looked at them, creating the disorienting sensation that they were moving just at the edge of his vision. "The linguists have been unable to decipher this script," Zekatharn continued. "But they have determined it is mathematically complex beyond any known ancient writing system. Some have suggested it may not be meant to be read sequentially at all, but rather experienced as a whole." "Like a program," Miller said softly, "or a summoning circle." The Vkr'lakian's mandibles clicked rapidly, the equivalent of a human clearing their throat uncomfortably. "That is not a scientific assessment, Lieutenant." "No, but it's what you're thinking, isn't it?" Miller leaned closer to the screen. "Otherwise, why contact me? There must be hundreds of human diplomats and scientists better qualified to consult on an archaeological find." Zekatharn was silent for a moment, The empirical truth has been experiencing anomalies since beginning work at this site. Systems malfunctions, unexplained power fluctuations, and reports from the crew of sightings. Sightings, Miller repeated flatly. Tall figures glimpsed in corridors that prove empty when investigated. Sounds of movement in sealed chambers. Voices in unknown languages emanating from communication systems disconnected from power. The Vkr'lak's antennae flattened against his head. 3 crew members have had to be sedated after experiencing what the medical officer diagnosed as acute stress reactions. Captain, Miller said carefully, why exactly are you calling me? The Confederation Council has authorized a joint scientific military expedition to thoroughly investigate these ruins. As a precautionary measure, they are assembling a team with diverse expertise, including representatives from species with extensive experience in xenoarchaeology, linguistics, and unexplained phenomena. Miller's eyes narrowed. And I have requested you be assigned as the human representative on this expedition. Zhek-Tharn's 4 eyes fixed on Miller with uncomfortable intensity. You have direct experience with the phenomena we are encountering, experience that may prove valuable. Experience from a holographic simulation malfunction, Miller pointed out, which we agreed was probably just a technical glitch. We agreed to say it was a technical glitch, Zhek-Tharn corrected. I do not believe either of us was entirely convinced of that explanation. Miller leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Let me get this straight. You want me to join an expedition to an ancient alien ruin that's apparently haunted by the same things we encountered in a simulation? The same things I made up for a ghost story? That is an oversimplification, but essentially correct. With all due respect, Captain, that sounds like a monumentally bad idea. Zhek-Tharn's mandibles spread slightly, the Vkr'lak approximation of a humorless smile. Perhaps. However, the expedition will proceed with or without your participation. The Confederation Council considers these ruins a discovery of potentially unprecedented significance. And if what we saw in that simulation was real, Miller said slowly, and somehow connected to these ruins, then the expedition may be facing threats it does not comprehend. Zhek-Tharn finished for him. Threats you have at least some familiarity with. Miller stared at the images on his screen. The impossible figures carved in ancient stone. The writing that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at it. A part of him wanted nothing more than to decline the invitation and stay safely on Earth. But another part, the part that had joined the military in the first place, the part that thrived on adrenaline and the unknown. When does the expedition leave? He heard himself asking. A transport will arrive at Earth in 7 standard days, Zhek-Tharn replied. I will forward the official documentation and clearances to your superiors. This is probably a terrible decision, Miller muttered. Quite possibly, the Vkr'lak agreed. However, there is an old saying among my people. Fear faced with companions becomes courage. Fear faced alone becomes madness. Miller laughed despite himself. We have a similar saying, hold my beer and watch this. Zhek-Tharn's head tilted in confusion. I do not understand the relevance. It means I'm in, Miller clarified. Against my better judgment. Excellent. The Vkr'lak's posture relaxed slightly. I shall inform the expedition leaders. Prepare for departure in 7 days, Lieutenant, and perhaps refresh your memory on those ghost stories of yours. As the communication ended, Miller sat back in his chair, staring at the frozen images still displayed on his screen. Ancient stone carvings of impossibly proportioned figures, writings that seemed to defy normal perception. What had he said to Zhek-Tharn all those months ago in the ship's mess hall? The universe is vast and ancient. Humans are young and small by comparison. We know there are monsters out there. We just want to be ready when we meet them. Miller closed the images and began composing his request for reassignment. It seemed the monsters were waiting, and ready or not, he was about to meet them. The end. Look, all I'm saying is that if your species had invented duct tape earlier, you wouldn't be in this mess, said Jack, casually tossing a wrench from one hand to the other while floating upside down relative to the aliens staring daggers at him. That is not the point, hissed Ambassador Vkr'lak, their neck frills flaring an impressive shade of indignant purple. The point is that your crew has violated 17 different sections of the Galactic Concordat's Technology Sharing Prohibition Act, and now the entire hegemony is demanding your immediate extradition. Jack scratched his stubbled chin with the wrench. Yeah, but did you see how fast their ships go now? This, as it turned out, was exactly the wrong thing to say. 3 standard cycles earlier. The galactic hegemony had been around for approximately 27,000 years before humans stumbled onto the interstellar scene. In that time, they'd developed a comprehensive bureaucracy that would make the most dedicated Earth paper pusher weep with envy. They had forms for everything. Forms to request forms. Forms to report the improper use of forms. Forms to requisition the recycling of improperly filled out forms. They also had very, very strict rules about technological development. It wasn't that the hegemony didn't believe in progress. They did. They just believed it should happen at a pace that could be properly documented, filed in triplicate, and approved by no fewer than 7 different committees. Humans, as first contact specialists quickly discovered, didn't share this philosophy. You want me to what? Lieutenant Commander Alexis Morgan stared at the holographic message floating above her desk aboard the UEN Tenacious. She was the chief engineer of humanity's first diplomatic vessel, and she was having trouble processing what she'd just been told. It's quite simple, Commander, replied the blue-tinged hologram of Admiral Winters. You're to conduct a standard mechanical inspection of the hegemony diplomatic vessel, offer any safety observations in a non-binding capacity, and most importantly... He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Do not, under any circumstances, tell them how to fix anything. Alexis blinked. Sir, with all due respect, that's literally my job. If I see something broken, I fix it. Not this time, Commander. The hegemony has some peculiar ideas about technological progress. They believe each species should develop at its own natural pace, without outside influence. Helping them bypass their own development cycles would violate their most sacred laws. But they invited us to inspect their engines. Yes, to inspect. Not to repair, modify, or, God forbid, improve. The Admiral pinched the bridge of his nose. Look, this is a diplomatic mission. Just be polite. Take notes, and keep your hands in your pockets. Alexis slumped back in her chair. Understood, sir. As soon as the Admiral's hologram blinked out, she turned to her second-in-command, Lieutenant Jack Thompson, who had been quietly pretending not to eavesdrop from the doorway. Did you hear that? She asked. Jack grinned, his eyes twinkling with the unique light of someone who had never met a rule he couldn't find a creative interpretation for. Sure did, boss. We're just supposed to look, not touch. Exactly. But he didn't say anything about what to do if they ask us questions, did he? Alexis narrowed her eyes. Jack, I'm just saying, if they happen to inquire about certain theoretical engineering principles that might, purely by coincidence, apply to the exact issues they're having, well, that's just polite conversation, isn't it? She shouldn't have smiled. It would only encourage him. But damn it, she did. The hegemony diplomatic vessel, the Orderly Progress, was sleek and beautiful from the outside, crafted from a pearlescent material that seemed to shift colors as it moved through space. It was nearly twice the size of the Tenacious, and boasted what appeared to be significantly more advanced technology. At least that's what the humans had assumed. Is that a mechanical gear system? Jack whispered as they were led through the engine room by Chief Engineer Trilvax, a tall, spindly alien with 4 arms and skin that resembled polished copper. Yes, Trilvax replied proudly, apparently missing Jack's incredulity. The P-43 rotational momentum transfer array is the pinnacle of hegemony engineering. It's been optimized over 700 years of incremental improvements. Alexis and Jack exchanged glances. The system before them wasn't just outdated by human standards, it was practically ancient. Earth had moved beyond mechanical gear propulsion systems for spacecraft nearly a century ago. It's very well maintained, Alexis offered diplomatically. Thank you, though we've been experiencing some difficulties with the central alignment recently. Nothing to worry about, of course. I'm sure after another decade or 2 of study, we'll develop a suitable modification. Jack made a strangled noise that he hastily turned into a cough. A decade? He squeaked. Trilvax tilted their head. Is that considered excessive by human standards? I assure you it's quite an accelerated timeline. The approval process alone usually takes at least 7 years. No, Alexis said quickly, stepping on Jack's foot before he could comment further. We're just admiring your methodical approach. The tour continued, with each new system they encountered proving more baffling than the last. The ship's computational systems used actual punch cards. The life support was regulated by a complex series of tubes and valves that took up an entire deck. And the navigation system, incredibly, involved physical star charts and a device that looked suspiciously like a sextant. Throughout it all, Trilvax and the other hegemony engineers beamed with pride, occasionally asking the humans' opinions on their technology, and noting down their carefully neutral responses with diligent attention. By the time they returned to the docking bay, Alexis was physically restraining Jack with a grip on his arm that would leave bruises. "Well, thank you for the fascinating tour," she said, her smile fixed firmly in place. "We'll compile our safety observations and submit them through the proper diplomatic channels." "Oh, but won't you join us for a meal first?" Trilvax asked. "It's traditional to discuss impressions immediately after an inspection. We're very eager to hear your thoughts." And that, as humans would later reflect, was where things started to go terribly, horribly wrong. The dining hall of the Orderly Progress was as ornate as the engine room was antiquated. Gleaming surfaces reflected the light from floating orbs that drifted near the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the assembled aliens and their human guests. Ambassador Vkr'lak, the hegemony's official representative to humanity, sat at the head of the table. Their species, the Vkr'lak, resembled Earth lizards if lizards had evolved to walk upright, wear elaborate robes, and develop superiority complexes. "So," they said once everyone was seated and served with bowls of something that smelled like cinnamon and looked like blue oatmeal, "what are your impressions of our vessel?" Alexis took a deep breath. "Ambassador, we found your ship to be unique. Your dedication to traditional methods is admirable." Vkr'lak's neck frills rippled with pleasure. "Yes, we believe in honoring the engineering principles of our ancestors. Each improvement must build naturally upon established foundations." "Speaking of improvements," Jack interjected, ignoring Alexis's warning glare, "I couldn't help but notice your central alignment issue with the P-43 system. Have you considered adjusting the tolerance ratio of the primary gears?" The table fell silent. Trilvax's four hands froze mid-gesture, a spoon of blue oatmeal suspended halfway to their mouth. "Tolerance ratio?" they repeated slowly. "Yeah, the clearance between interlocking gear teeth. If you tighten it by about 0.03 millimeters, you'd eliminate that wobble you're getting at high rotations." Alexis closed her eyes briefly, mentally composing her resignation letter. But to her surprise, instead of outrage, there was fascination. Is that possible?" another hegemony engineer asked, leaning forward eagerly. "Sure," Jack said with a shrug. "It's basic mechanical engineering. You could probably fix it in an afternoon with the right tools." "An afternoon," Trilvax whispered, as if Jack had just suggested they could achieve faster-than-light travel using nothing but a rubber band and optimism. "Not a decade?" "Well, no, it's just a small adjustment. You don't need to redesign the whole system." The hegemony engineers began whispering excitedly amongst themselves, occasionally glancing at Jack with what could only be described as reverence. Ambassador Vkr'lak, however, was not looking reverent. Their frills had darkened to a concerning shade of crimson. "Lieutenant Thompson," they said carefully, "are you suggesting that you could improve our propulsion system without going through the proper development and approval processes?" Jack, completely missing the danger in the ambassador's tone, grinned. "Oh, definitely. In fact, I spotted at least a dozen improvements that could be made to various systems throughout your ship. No offense, but some of your tech is a bit, outdated." Alexis kicked him under the table. "Hard." "What my colleague means," she jumped in, "is that human engineering traditions sometimes take a different approach to problem solving. It's simply a cultural difference, not a judgment on your methods." But it was too late. The ambassador's frills were now practically glowing with indignation. "I see," they said coldly. "And would you be willing to document these improvements you believe could be made to our sacred technological traditions?" Jack, still oblivious, nodded enthusiastically. "Sure. I'd be happy to write up some suggestions. It's really just about efficiency, Why wait years to fix something when you could do it today?" And that was how, less than 24 hours later, the human diplomatic mission found itself in the middle of what would later be termed the Great Hegemony Technological Crisis of 2157. The crisis, as it turned out, wasn't that Jack had offended the hegemony leadership. Quite the opposite. The real problem began when Trilvax and several other engineers secretly approached him after dinner, cornering him in a corridor near the human quarters. "Lieutenant Thompson," Trilvax whispered, all four hands wringing nervously. "We must speak with you privately." Jack, who had finally been made aware of his diplomatic faux pas thanks to a 45-minute lecture from Alexis, was understandably cautious. "Look, if this is about what I said at dinner, I want to apologize. I didn't mean to disrespect your traditions." No, Trilvax insisted, looking over their shoulder as if expecting to be caught at any moment. We want to know more. More? About these adjustments. About how humans approach engineering problems. About... They lowered their voice even further. Improvisation. Jack blinked. You're not offended? One of the other engineers, a squat, blue-skinned being with enormous eyes, spoke up. The leadership maintains the traditional pace of development because it ensures stability and control. But many of us have long suspected there could be faster ways. It's just that suggesting such things openly is not encouraged, Trilvax added. A slow smile spread across Jack's face. Well, I mean, I wouldn't want to interfere with your cultural practices. Please, Trilvax said, laying one of their copper-colored hands on Jack's arm. Just theories, just concepts. No one needs to know. Jack Thompson had never been very good at saying no to intellectual curiosity, especially when it came wrapped in the thrill of mild rebellion. All right, he said. Hypothetically speaking, if you were to address that alignment issue. 3 days later, Alexis couldn't find Jack anywhere on the Tenacious. Computer, locate Lieutenant Thompson, she commanded for the third time, pacing her office. Lieutenant Thompson is not aboard the Tenacious. The ship's AI responded patiently. Then where the hell is he? Lieutenant Thompson's communications device is currently active aboard the hegemony vessel, Orderly Progress. Alexis froze. For how long? Lieutenant Thompson has been aboard the Orderly Progress for approximately 72 hours and 17 minutes. What? She exploded. Why wasn't I notified? You didn't ask, the AI replied simply. Alexis grabbed her tablet and stormed toward the docking bay, firing off a message to Admiral Winters that consisted primarily of expletives and apologies in equal measure. When she arrived at the Orderly Progress, she was met not by the expected security detail, but by a beaming Trilvax. Commander Morgan, what perfect timing. We were just about to invite more of your engineering team over. Where is Lieutenant Thompson? She demanded. Oh, Jack, he's in the engine room. Such a remarkable human. You really should see what he's done. It's revolutionary. The way Trilvax said revolutionary made Alexis's blood run cold. In her experience, revolutions rarely ended well for everyone involved. She followed Trilvax through the corridors of the alien ship, noticing immediately that something was different. The lighting seemed brighter, the air circulation more efficient, and was the artificial gravity more stable. When they reached the engine room, she stopped dead in her tracks. The once cluttered space had been transformed. The massive gear system was still there, but it had been modified in dozens of subtle ways. Tools and parts that were definitely of human design were integrated into hegemony technology. And in the center of it all was Jack, floating upside down relative to a group of enraptured alien engineers, explaining something about bypass circuits and friction coefficients with animated gestures. Jack! She shouted. He spun in midair, his face lighting up. Alexis, perfect timing. You've got to see this. We've increased their engine efficiency by 63% already, and that's just the beginning. Lieutenant, she hissed, may I speak with you privately? The aliens parted as she pushed off toward him, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward a corner. Have you lost your mind? She whispered furiously. Admiral Winters explicitly ordered us not to interfere with their technology. Jack had the decency to look slightly abashed. Technically, I'm not interfering. They asked for help, I'm just consulting. For 3 days? Well, one thing led to another, you know how it is. They had questions, I had answers, and then suddenly we were replacing their coolant system with something that doesn't require physical ice blocks to be manually inserted every 4 hours, and... Physical ice blocks? Despite herself, Alexis was momentarily distracted. Are you serious? I know, right? It's like they deliberately chose the most complicated way to do everything. But that's not even the best part. Wait till you see what we did to their waste reclamation system. 2 words. Composting toilets. They were blown away. Alexis pinched the bridge of her nose. Jack, this isn't a joke. This is a serious diplomatic... She was interrupted by an alarm that sounded remarkably like an old-fashioned bicycle horn. Moments later, the engine room doors slid open, more smoothly than before, she couldn't help but notice, to reveal Ambassador Vkr'lak flanked by several official-looking aliens wearing what appeared to be ceremonial armor. Lieutenant Thompson, the ambassador said icily, I believe we need to have a conversation about unauthorized technological transfers. The conversation took place in what the hegemony called a conflict resolution chamber, but what humans would more accurately describe as a courtroom. Alexis and Jack sat at a small table facing a panel of 7 aliens of various species, all wearing elaborate headdresses that apparently signified their authority. Ambassador Vkr'lak stood to one side, periodically interjecting with legal references and disapproving hisses. "Let me be clear about the charges," said the central panel member, a bulbous creature with tentacles draped over what resembled a judge's bench. "Lieutenant Jack Thompson, you are accused of violating Section 42, Subsection 7, Paragraph 13 of the Technological Development Non-Interference Treaty by sharing advanced engineering concepts with hegemony citizens without proper authorization." "But they asked," Jack protested. "Irrelevant," snapped Vkr'lak. "The law exists to protect the natural developmental trajectory of all species. The fact that certain individuals—" They cast a withering glance toward Vkr'lak, who sat hunched in the spectator area. "Were willing to circumvent proper procedures does not excuse your actions." "If I may," Alexis interjected, "Lieutenant Thompson was acting without authorization from Earth government as well. This was an individual error in judgment, not an official attempt to interfere with hegemony development." The judge-like alien's tentacles rippled thoughtfully. "That may mitigate diplomatic repercussions between our civilizations, but it does not address the core violation. The fact remains that unauthorized technological concepts have been introduced to our engineers. The damage, as they say, is done." "Damage?" Jack couldn't help but scoff. "Your engines are running 63% more efficiently. Your life support no longer requires manual adjustment every 3 hours. And let's not forget, your toilets don't need to be emptied by hand anymore. How exactly is any of that damage?" The entire panel seemed to recoil in horror at his bluntness. "You don't understand," hissed one of the other panel members. "It's not about whether the changes are beneficial. It's about the process. Development must proceed according to established timelines and through proper channels. Innovation without authorization leads to chaos." "With all due respect," Jack said, leaning forward, "that's just not how humans work. We see problems, we fix them. We don't wait for a committee to tell us it's okay to make something better." "Which is precisely why your species presents such a danger," Vkr'lak interjected. "Your reckless approach to technological development could destabilize thousands of years of carefully managed progress throughout the galaxy." Alexis placed a restraining hand on Jack's arm before he could retort. "Ambassador, panel members, I understand your concerns, but surely there must be a way to resolve this situation without escalating it further. Lieutenant Thompson acted out of a genuine desire to help, not to cause harm." The central judge's tentacles writhed in what might have been the alien equivalent of a sigh. "There is one potential solution. The knowledge cannot be unshared, but we could prevent further contamination." "What do you mean?" Alexis asked warily. "Lieutenant Thompson could remain in hegemony custody until such time as a proper assessment of the technological impact can be completed and appropriate adaptation strategies implemented." "You want to imprison him?" Alexis demanded, rising to her feet. "Not imprison," Vkr'lak corrected smoothly. "Merely contain, for the greater good." Jack laughed incredulously. "You're kidding, right? How long would this containment last?" The panel members exchanged glances. Given the scope of the technological concepts involved, perhaps 20 to 30 of your Earth years. 30 years? Both humans shouted in unison. "That is unusually expedited," one panel member admitted. "But given the circumstances..." Alexis was already reaching for her communication device. "I need to contact our government immediately. This is completely unacceptable." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Vkr'lak said. "For security reasons, all communication with your vessel has been temporarily suspended." The implications hit her like a physical blow. "You're detaining us both? This is an act of war." "Not war," the central judge corrected. "A preventative measure to ensure galactic stability. Once proper protocols are established for handling human technological influence, normal diplomatic relations can resume." Jack leaned close to Alexis. "I think we might be in trouble," he whispered. She gave him a look that could have melted steel. "You think?" The containment facility wasn't exactly a prison cell, but it wasn't a luxury suite either. It consisted of 2 small rooms with basic amenities and a shared common area. There were no windows, and the door had no visible control panel on the inside. "I can't believe this," Alexis muttered, pacing the limited floor space. 30 years. 30 years because you couldn't keep your mouth shut about gear tolerances." Jack flopped onto one of the cushioned platforms that apparently served as hegemony furniture. "Look on the bright side." There is no bright side. Sure there is. Earth knows where we are. When we don't report back, they'll send someone to check on us. And then what? Start a war with an entire galactic civilization? Jack shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe they'll negotiate. Either way, I doubt we'll actually be here for 30 years. Alexis slumped onto the platform beside him. I should have left you in engineering where you belong. You're a menace to interstellar diplomacy. Hey, I was just trying to help. Those engineers were practically begging for information. You should have seen their faces when I showed them how to recalibrate their sensor array. It was like I'd given them the secret to eternal life or something. Despite her anger, Alexis couldn't help but smile slightly. You did all this in 3 days? Well, I didn't sleep much. Too excited. Do you know they still use punch cards for their navigation computations? Actual physical punch cards. I showed them how to set up a basic electronic processor using parts they already had for other systems, and one of them actually fainted. She shook her head. You can't help yourself, can you? Not when it comes to fixing things, no. He sat up suddenly. Speaking of which... Jack moved to the wall and began running his hands over it, pressing in different spots. What are you doing? Looking for an access panel. All these ships have maintenance access points, even in secure areas. Standard design principle. Jack, even if you find one, what exactly are you planning to do? We're on an alien ship surrounded by an entire civilization that thinks we're technological terrorists. We can't exactly make a run for it. He grinned over his shoulder. Who said anything about running? I'm thinking more along the lines of negotiating from a position of strength. What does that mean? Instead of answering, he gave a triumphant aha as one section of the wall slid aside, revealing a mess of tubes, wires, and what appeared to be actual gears controlling various ship systems. Bingo, Jack said, already examining the components. Now, if I'm understanding their systems correctly, which I think I do after spending 3 days elbow deep in them, he began manipulating various parts, occasionally muttering to himself about ridiculous over-engineering and why use 10 parts when 100 will do. Alexis watched him with growing alarm. Jack, whatever you're doing, stop it. You're just going to make things worse. Trust me, he said, not looking up from his work. Sometimes you have to create a problem before you can offer a solution. Alarms were blaring throughout the orderly progress. By the time Vkr'lak stormed into the containment area, flanked by security personnel, their neck frills were pulsating between purple and red so rapidly it almost looked like a strobe effect. What have you done? They demanded. Jack, who was sitting calmly on his cushioned platform, as if he hadn't just spent the last hour dismantling part of the wall, looked up with innocent surprise. Me, nothing. But I couldn't help but notice your life support system seems to be having some issues. On cue, the lights flickered, and the artificial gravity briefly weakened before stabilizing. The entire residential section is experiencing cascading systems failures, one of the security officers reported. Engineering cannot determine the cause. I might have some insight into that, Jack offered casually. Vkr'lak's frills settled on a dangerous shade of crimson. This is sabotage! No, Jack corrected. This is a mechanical fault that I happen to have noticed due to my extensive familiarity with your systems. Totally natural occurrence. Probably would have happened anyway. Eventually. Might have been decades, though. Alexis closed her eyes briefly, caught between admiration for Jack's audacity and fear of the diplomatic catastrophe they were hurtling toward. Fix it, Vkr'lak demanded. Fix it immediately. Jack leaned back. I'd be happy to help, of course, but I think we need to discuss terms first. Terms? The ambassador's voice rose to a register that made both humans wince. You are in no position to negotiate. Another alarm joined the cacophony, and the ship shuddered slightly. Actually, Jack said, still infuriatingly calm, I think I am. You see, while I was working on your engine systems, I got a pretty good understanding of how everything connects. And right now, you've got about... He glanced at the timepiece on his wrist. 43 minutes before the life support in this section fails completely. Could be less if those backup systems you installed last century are as poorly maintained as they looked. The security officers looked at Vkr'lak with alarm. One of them whispered something that made the ambassador's frills droop momentarily. What do you want? They finally asked, voice tight with suppressed rage. Simple. Release us. Let us return to our ship, and agree to drop all charges of unauthorized technological transfer. In return, I'll fix your current problem and leave detailed instructions on how to prevent similar issues in the future. That is blackmail. Jack shrugged. I prefer to think of it as expedited negotiation. Much faster than your usual methods, I admit, but time is rather of the essence. Alexis stepped forward. Ambassador, I don't condone Lieutenant Thompson's methods, but perhaps this situation highlights the fundamental disconnect between our cultures. Humans value efficiency and direct problem-solving. Your civilization values process and incremental change. Neither approach is inherently wrong, but they are different. Difference is not an excuse for causing deliberate harm, Vkr'lak retorted. No harm will come to anyone if you accept our terms, Jack pointed out. Everyone walks away happy. You get your ship fixed, we get our freedom, and your engineers get to study the repairs I've already made at their own pace. Another violent shudder ran through the ship, and several more alarms joined the chorus. One of the officers leaned close to Vkr'lak, obviously urging a decision. The ambassador's frills rippled through several colors in rapid succession before finally settling on a defeated pale blue. Very well, they hissed. Fix the ship, and you may return to your vessel. But this incident will be reported to the Hegemony Council, and there will be consequences for Earth's relations with our civilization. Jack was already moving toward the exposed wall panel. Fair enough. Might want to evacuate non-essential personnel from Section 7, by the way, just as a precaution. As the ambassador and most of the security team hurried out, Jack glanced at Alexis with a small smile. See, negotiation. She shook her head. You're either going to win us a Nobel Peace Prize or start the first interstellar war in human history. Why not both? He replied cheerfully, diving back into the tangle of alien technology. 3 hours later, the alarms had stopped, the ship's systems were functioning better than before the crisis, and Jack had provided detailed schematics for the repairs he'd made, complete with careful explanations of the underlying principles, written at what he called a hegemony-friendly pace. As they prepared to return to the Tenacious, they were surprised to find Vkr'lak waiting by the airlock, along with a group of engineers. We wanted to thank you, the alien said quietly, casting nervous glances over their shoulder. What you've shown us, it's opened our eyes to possibilities we never considered. Just doing my job, Jack replied with a grin. Sorry about all the drama. Vkr'lak extended all 4 hands, each holding a small device. These are data crystals containing questions, theoretical questions only, of course, that we've been collecting for generations. Things our brightest minds have pondered but never been allowed to fully explore, due to development restrictions. Alexis stepped forward before Jack could take them. I'm not sure this is a good idea. The ambassador was clear about no further technological exchange. It's not technology, one of the other engineers insisted. Just questions, curiosities. The answers would be for us to discover, perhaps with occasional guidance. Jack looked at Alexis with pleading eyes. Come on, boss. They're just curious. Isn't that the whole point of this mission? Cultural exchange? She sighed deeply. I am absolutely going to regret this. But she took the data crystals. Look, all I'm saying is that if your species had invented duct tape earlier, you wouldn't be in this mess, said Jack, casually tossing a wrench from one hand to the other while floating upside down relative to the alien staring daggers at him. That is not the point, hissed Ambassador Vkr'lak, their neck frills flaring an impressive shade of indignant purple. The point is that your crew has violated 17 different sections of the Galactic Confederacy's Technology Sharing Prohibition Act, and now the entire hegemony is demanding your immediate extradition. Jack scratched his stubbled chin with the wrench. Yeah, but did you see how fast their ships go now? Admiral Winters, visible on the large view screen of the Tenacious conference room, looked like he was about to have an aneurysm. Lieutenant Thompson, you are not helping the situation. It had been 6 months since the incident aboard the Orderly Progress. 6 months during which Jack and Alexis had returned to Earth, been debriefed extensively, and then, to everyone's surprise, been sent back to continue the diplomatic mission with the hegemony. 6 months during which, apparently, the data crystals from Vkr'lak had sparked what hegemony officials were now calling the Great Disruption. Admiral, Alexis said, trying to salvage the situation. We had no way of knowing that those questions would lead to such widespread experimentation. Experimentation? Vkr'lak practically shrieked. Half the engineering guilds in the central systems are in open revolt against established development protocols. We have ships moving at twice their designated speeds. Communication systems bypassing the official relay network. Climate control systems being modified without filing the proper variance requests. It's anarchy. Jack couldn't quite suppress his smile. Sounds like progress to me. The Admiral shot him a warning glare before addressing the ambassador. Ambassador Vkr'lak, on behalf of Earth government, I want to express our sincere regret for any disruption caused to your society. However, I must point out that Lieutenant Thompson and Commander Morgan did not force anyone to implement these changes. They merely provided information, which hegemony citizens chose to act upon. Information is not neutral, the ambassador insisted. Your human approach to problem solving is infectious. It spreads like a virus among our more impressionable minds. If I may, Alexis interjected carefully, perhaps this situation reveals a deeper issue within the hegemony itself. If so many of your people are eager to embrace a more direct approach to technological development, is it possible that your current system isn't serving everyone's needs? The ambassador's frills drooped slightly. For a moment, they almost looked tired rather than angry. You don't understand the history, they said quietly. Before the Concordat, before the carefully regulated development protocols, there was chaos. Species advancing too quickly, developing weapons before they developed the wisdom to use them responsibly. Entire civilizations wiping themselves out, or worse, threatening others. The hegemony's approach has maintained peace for millennia. At the cost of stagnation, Jack pointed out, more gently than before. Look, I get it. Rules exist for a reason, but rules that don't adapt, that don't account for individual creativity and initiative, eventually break down anyway. Admiral Winters cleared his throat. Perhaps there's a middle ground to be found here, a way to allow for innovation while maintaining appropriate safeguards. The Council would never agree, Vkr'lak said, but there was a note of uncertainty in their voice. They might, Alexis suggested, if the alternative is widespread civil disobedience. From what you're describing, it sounds like this movement has already gained significant momentum. It has, the ambassador admitted reluctantly. And the most troubling part is that many high-ranking officials are secretly supporting it. Even some council members have expressed curiosity about human